Okay, good evening, everyone. We're going to get started. Welcome to the first public lecture series for 2010 and 11. I'm very pleased to introduce the speaker. Let me start by mentioning a movie that will be released on October 8, 2010, less than a month from now. It's called Inside Job. It's a documentary about the 2008 financial meltdown and the resulting crisis. It received wide praise from critics when shown in Cannes, New York, and Toronto film festivals. And you should see this movie. Our speaker, Professor Andrew Lowe, is featured in the movie, along with Representative Barney Frank and former New York Governor Eliot Spitzer. Andrew Lowe is the Harris and Harris Group Professor and Director of Laboratory for Financial Engineering at MIT. Professor Lowe received his PhD in economics from Harvard at the age of 24. He did his undergraduate in economics and mathematics. He was a professor at Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, and then he's been at MIT since 1988. Among many honors he's received for his research are the Sloan Foundation Fellowship, the Paul Samuelson Award, and the Guggenheim Fellowship. He's author of many influential papers and books. I'll read a couple titles of the books that Andy has written over the years. A Non-Random Walk Down Wall Street, Hedge Funds, An Analytic Perspective, and one with a very provocative Harry Potter-like title, The Heretics of Finance. As successful as he is in academic, he's among the world's most respected and sought-after authorities in finance. He's in the news a lot. He's just been quoted a few days ago in a Newsweek article entitled, Our Best Minds Are Failing Us. He's also quoted often on Wall Street Journal. He's a counterexample of the old adage about teachers. Not only does he teach finance, he also is a fund manager. In 1999, he founded Alpha Simplex, an investment advisory company where he remains its chief scientific officer. More recently, he helped design a fund called ProShares Credit Suisse 130/30. Remember that number? Which I'm happy to report is doing better than S&P 500 over the last year. So you might want to change your financial position after this talk. So without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Professor Andrew Lowe.
I'd like to start by thanking Fadil Santosa and the University of Minnesota's Institute for Mathematics and its Applications for inviting me to deliver this public lecture. It's both a pleasure and a privilege to be here, particularly with so many high school students who I think actually is the future of both finance and mathematics, and I'm going to get to that towards the end. I'm particularly pleased to be at the IMA because actually the IMA was part of my initial career. When I was an assistant professor, I remember coming here and participating in a conference on stochastic differential equations. And so it's really an honor for me to be back now giving this public lecture. Now the title that I gave for this lecture is rather provocative. How financial engineering can cure cancer, solve the energy crisis, and stop global warming. And one of my colleagues said, why don't you just focus on one of those three? That would be enough. But I want to be a little bit more ambitious tonight and try to expand the scope of where I think finance can take us. And just before we begin, let me just ask by a show of hands of those high school students, how many of you who are in high school now are actually thinking about a career in the financial industry? Can you raise your hand? Yeah, not too many. That's why we had a financial crisis. We need smarter people to get into this field and to help out. And so I'm going to start tonight's lecture by spending a few minutes talking about the financial crisis. Because how can we talk about curing all of society's greatest ills, having just gone through a tremendously tumultuous, disruptive, devastating, frightening period where millions of Americans were thrown out of their homes, lost their jobs, and we're still now, even today, struggling with this crisis. It's been a very, very challenging period, so I don't want to make light of it, and I want to be sensitive to those of you who may be going through difficult times as a result. But what I want to do in the end is to deliver a message that's far more positive and exciting, because the crisis tells us something very important about what's possible. Now you might say, gee, that we can be really stupid about finance. Yes, it can tell us that. But it can tell us something far more important, which is the power of financial engineering to accomplish extraordinary things in society. So in order for me to get to that point, I need to spend a few minutes taking you through the challenges of the financial crisis. So I apologize in advance if I cause anybody pain in terms of reviewing the difficult events of the last few years. And I'll do this quickly because having talked about the financial crisis on so many occasions now, I've managed to squeeze all of it into one slide. And here it is. This is the entire financial crisis summarized in one slide. As many of you know, it began really with the housing market. During the 1990s, period of low interest rates, lots of homes were purchased through mortgages and other creative financing techniques. And those creative financing techniques really allowed an unprecedented amount of capital to enter into the U.S. residential real estate market, pushing prices up to unprecedented levels. At some point, the party had to stop. And once housing markets started going down, we had an unprecedented wave of foreclosures, defaults, and large organizations like AIG and Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns, failing and requiring a government bailout. And the question that I'm sure is on everybody's mind is, how could this have happened to us, one of the most sophisticated financial centers of the world? How could we have succumbed to this kind of set of events? And shortly after Lehman Brothers went under, CNN started featuring a spot that they called the Hall of Shame. I don't know how many of you caught it, because it was only around for a couple of weeks. And in this segment, they would feature the particular individuals that they deemed were responsible for the crisis. So they had the head of Countrywide, they had the head of the SEC, they had the head of Lehman Brothers pictured in this rogues gallery. And pretty soon, they decided to cut the segment. Why? In my opinion, it's because they ran out of room in the Hall of Shame. Because if you did an honest accounting of who was responsible for the crisis, not to say that there weren't parties that were more responsible than others, but truly, if you were to do an honest assessment of how this housing bubble could have developed, that Hall of Shame would pretty soon include everybody, from homeowners, commercial banks, investment banks, mortgage lenders, credit rating agencies, insurance companies, regulators, government-sponsored enterprises like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and even politicians. We were all complicit in this crisis. That's what makes it so difficult to understand. It's because it wasn't just one guilty party. If we could find that guilty party and put him in jail, that would solve all of our problems. That's not what happened. And so what I'd like to focus on for the first half of the talk, in particular, is the role of financial engineering. Because that is also one of the parties that were blamed. That's the models, the methods, the mathematics behind all of these complicated financial innovations. And I want to spend a few minutes going over that. I realize that it's in the evening and late for some of you, so I'm going to make this relatively simple. I'm going to go through a very simple numerical example of one of the most important financial innovations that underlies this crisis. And by the end of this example, all of you, I promise, all of you will understand the basic ideas that really generated the crisis that we experienced over the last few years. And it required nothing more than some very simple probability in high school algebra. So here we go. What I'm going to talk about is the magic of securitization. And you may have heard of that in the newspapers, but not really understand what's involved. Let me just give you a very simple illustration of it. I'm going to start with a piece of paper, a green piece of paper, an IOU, or a loan. This piece of paper says whoever holds the piece of paper has the right to get paid $1,000 at some point in time, let's say, I don't know, a year from now. So you could think of this as an IOU that somebody issued at some point, and now it's just floating around, and people are trading it back and forth. And the question is, how much would you be willing to pay for this piece of paper, this green piece of paper that will pay you $1,000 a year from now? Well, now you might think, geez, if the interest rate is 5%, then I'll pay a 5% discount so that after a year, whatever I pay today will grow to $1,000. That's what it's sort of worth. But I'm going to make it a little bit more complicated. I'm going to say that this piece of paper might not pay anything. There's a chance that it could default. Okay? So there's a chance that it'll pay $1,000, but there's a chance that it'll pay nothing. It'll be worthless. And let's suppose that the probabilities are 90-10. So with a flip of an unfair coin, 90% of the time you will get $1,000. 10% of the time you'll get nothing. How much would you pay for this? What do you think it's worth today? Any guesses? Yeah, what would you guess?
$100.
$100. Ooh, you're tough. Anybody willing to pay more than 100? Yeah, how much would you pay? 800. Anybody willing to go higher than 800? Yeah, what would you pay? $899. Anybody going higher than $899? What? Going once? Going twice? Yes? 900 sold. Now, I presume you got that because you did a little math, a very little math, and you calculated the expected value, which is exactly $900. But the person who bid $899, I actually sympathize because what you're saying is, why should I pay the expected value? I'm going to pay a little bit less and try to get something extra. That's perfectly legitimate because you're taking risks, okay? So, but somewhere around $899, $900, that's about what it's worth. By the way, I should say that this is not a terribly attractive piece of paper, right? In the sense that how many people would actually pay $900 for it right now on the spot? Nobody? Not even the person who bid? Okay, now we're talking. My guess is that if I actually tried to auction this off, I'd have to be willing to take a price well below $900, which suggests that at $900, it's not a terribly attractive piece of paper. Well, if you think that that's not attractive, what if I give you more of it? What if I give you a second piece of paper that's identical? Would more of the same be better? This is like the old story about the two ladies in the Catskills at a mediocre hotel. One lady says, gee, the food here, it's so bad. And the other lady says, yeah, in such small portions. You don't want more if you don't like the first piece of paper, do you? Well, what I'm about to show you, this magic of securitization, is going to change your mind completely about what is possible with financial engineering. And it may help to think about the following analogy. It's often said that the children of two ugly parents are rarely attractive. Now, of course, that doesn't apply to anybody here in this audience, but you can see how the genetics might work that way. But what I'm about to show you with the magic of securitization is that it's possible for two ugly parents to have two children, one of whom is a beautiful-looking supermodel, and the other one is an ugly, deformed Quasimodo. That will be the magic of securitization. And how am I going to do this? I'm going to do this by taking these two pieces of paper, neither of which are particularly attractive, and I'm going to put them into a portfolio. Now, what does that mean other than drawing a red circle around them? What does it mean to put it into a portfolio? What it means is I'm going to create a company, and the company will own these two green pieces of paper. And then I'm going to issue new pieces of paper that are claims on this company. And for sake of argument, let's call this company, I don't know, a special purpose vehicle. You'll understand why later. So now I've got this special purpose vehicle that owns these two pieces of paper that are not terribly attractive. And I'm about to issue new pieces of paper that are claims on the value of this portfolio. Before I can talk about the pricing of those new pieces of paper, I have to tell you a little bit about the statistical properties of this portfolio. In particular, I have to tell you something about how these two pieces of paper may or may not default. We know that each of them defaults with 90% or with 10% probability, with 90% probability to pay off. But how are they related? And so let me assume that they're related not at all, in the sense that they're statistically independent. That means that they're two separate coin tosses with different coins. And so whether or not one pays off has no bearing on whether the other pays off. They're both the same kind of coin, 90-10, but they're independent tosses, okay? Now, if we know that, then what is the value of this portfolio? Well, there are three possibilities, right? The three possibilities are they both pay off, they both default, or only one of the two pays off and the other defaults. And in those three different scenarios, the value of that portfolio is $2,000, $1,000, and $0. And the probabilities of those three outcomes are 81%, 18%, and 1%. How did I get that? Well, the 81% is if they both pay off, the probabilities are going to be 0.9 times 0.9, because they're independent. That's 0.81. In the case where they both default, there's a 10% chance of each. 0.1 times 0.1 is 0.01. And whatever's left over is the middle possibility, right? Okay, now we know everything there is to know about this portfolio. We know the probability rules. We know the different possible outcomes. We are now ready to engage in this magic of financial engineering. And the magic of financial engineering is I'm now going to create two new pieces of paper, different colors. One is blue, one is orange. They both have $1,000 face value, meaning that when they pay off next year, if they pay off, they pay $1,000. But the different colors indicate one very special feature that's not true of the green pieces of paper. The special feature is that there is an order, a priority in which they get paid off. And the priority is that the blue piece of paper has to get paid off first before the orange piece of paper can get paid anything. The blue piece of paper has higher priority. Only after the blue piece of paper gets paid its $1,000, if there's anything left over, we'll go to the orange piece of paper. Otherwise, they are identical in every other respect. Okay? This is the magic of securitization. See, this is the magic? Well, let me show you what the magic is, and you'll see that this is remarkable. Given this probability table, let's take a look at what the values of the blue and orange pieces of paper are under the different scenarios. The blue piece of paper gets paid off if the value of the portfolio is $2,000 or $1,000, and in the case where the portfolio is worth nothing, the blue piece of paper is worthless too. On the other hand, the orange piece of paper can only get paid off after the blue piece of paper. So the orange piece of paper is going to be paid off only if the portfolio is worth $2,000. If the portfolio is only worth $1,000, you know where that $1,000 is going, right? It's going to blue. And if you're orange, you're out of luck. So your payoff as the orange holder is $1,000 or 0 and 0, whereas if you're the blue piece of paper, you are $1,000, 1,000 and 0. Now let's give the blue and orange pieces of paper names. The blue piece of paper I'm going to call the senior tranche of this portfolio, and the orange piece of paper I'm going to call the junior tranche, because it's junior to the higher priority claim. And in this case, the bad state for the blue piece of paper is only 1%. There's only a 1% probability that the blue piece of paper doesn't pay off. Remember what the bad state was for the original green pieces of paper? 10%. That's pretty bad. 10% is a pretty high chance that it doesn't get paid off. That's why most of you weren't even willing to pay $900 for that green piece of paper. But now, the blue piece of paper gets paid off almost always. 99 out of 100 times, the blue piece of paper gets paid off. What about the orange piece of paper? The orange piece of paper is much worse. It doesn't get paid off 18 plus 1, or 19% of the time. 19% of the time instead of 10%. So what have I done? The magic of securitization has allowed me to create two new securities, one of which is much, much safer, and the other of which is much, much riskier. When you add them together, I've neither created nor destroyed value, but I have changed the risks of these two pieces of paper with one simple rule change, which is priority of payment. Okay? Now, who cares about all of this? Well, let me explain why all of you should care about this. In order to explain why this is important, I have to give you a little bit of history on the default experience that corporate bonds in the United States have racked up over the last 80 years. This is a chart from one of the rating agencies, Moody's. They're the ones that tell you how risky a particular bond is, and they've been chastised because they did a very bad job of rating the riskiness of some of these very complex instruments that we're going to talk about in a minute. Well, this is an example of the ratings that they gave for various corporate bonds from 1920 to 1999. So this is well before the current financial crisis, and it's a history of the actual default rates of bonds that were given certain kinds of ratings. So for example, the very best ratings that Moody's give out to corporate bonds, the very safest bonds of the most well-established companies with the very, very best credit histories, is something called AAA. You may have heard of that, AAA. AAA rating says that it's very, very unlikely for a bond to default. And in fact, we can see the historical experience. If you take a look at all the bonds that have ever been issued at a AAA rating in the history from 1920 to 1999, in the first 5 years, the number of bonds that were AAA that actually defaulted is 0.02%. You can't even see it on that graph. It's so small. It's very rare. Now, if you wait long enough, even the very best bonds might by accident default. If you waited 20 years, then this graph here shows you that the probability of actual default, the realized frequency, is about 2.5%. So a AAA rating says that the likelihood of default is somewhere between 0.02% and 2.5%. Given this historical table, you tell me, how should we rate the blue pieces of paper that have a 1% default rate? What would you rate them? Where would they fit in this scheme of things? Yeah, AAA, they belong here. AAA is somewhere between 0.02% and 2.5%. So AAA should be about right. Now, if we look at the orange piece of paper, the one that defaults 19% of the time, where would you rate that? Well, BA. And if we look at the historical rates, that's about right. That's about somewhere in that 19% range. Now, why am I telling you this? I'm telling you because these ratings are used by investors worldwide to make decisions on how to put their money, how to allocate their funds. And very conservative organizations, very large conservative organizations like pension funds, banks, mutual funds, money market funds, they prefer things that are really safe. They prefer AAA securities. In fact, AAA securities sometimes are not even safe enough for these institutions. They are so concerned about riskiness. And so when these securities, these blue and orange pieces of paper were created, the folks that created them realized that they could sell lots and lots of these pieces of paper to investors like money market funds, banks, and insurance companies. But they realized that they could sell even more if they could make them even safer. So what did they do? They said, you know what, 1% default for the blue pieces of paper, that's already pretty safe. But you're a bank, you don't even want to risk 1% default. So how about this? I'm going to make it even safer for you. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to buy insurance on that security for you, so that if in the unlikely 1% event that blue piece of paper doesn't pay, I'm going to have the insurance company pay you your principal back. I'm going to have the insurance company guarantee that your principal is safe. And just to make it really super safe, so that you don't have any worries at all, I'm going to only deal with the very biggest insurance companies out there, like, I don't know, how about AIG? You see where this is going? Okay. So now this explains how it could be that these blue pieces of paper proliferated throughout the last 10 years. Tremendous amounts of money were invested by banks, insurance companies, money market funds, sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, into these blue pieces of paper with the added insurance known as credit default swaps with large insurance companies like AIG as counterparties. Now that explains why financial securitization was so important for the blue pieces of paper. But what about the Quasimodo bonds, the orange pieces of paper, these ugly things that have a 19% default rate? That's terrible. Who would want that? In fact, these are considered below investment grade, so that by law, pension funds are not even allowed to buy them. If it's below BAA, as a pension fund, you are not even allowed to purchase these securities. So who bought them? Who bought these orange pieces of paper? Anybody know? The answer? Hedge funds. Hedge funds, as many of you know, are unregulated private investment partnerships that can take on all sorts of risks. They're looking for big paydays, right? They're willing to take big risk, but they want to see big return. And with these kinds of bonds, these orange bonds, they have a pretty big risk, but when they do pay off, they also pay off big. Now, how big do they get paid off? Well, let's do the same calculation that all of you did at the beginning. Let's calculate the expected value. If you calculate the expected value for the blue piece of paper, it's $990. $990. That's almost $1,000. You're paying almost par. And the reason you're paying almost par is because there's not a lot of risk. It's only 1%. And if you're willing to put insurance on top of that, maybe some of you would pay $999 for this. But look at the junior tranche. There you're only paying $810. $810 for a $1,000 payoff. If that bond pays off, you're earning 20%. That's pretty nice. But there's a chance that you get nothing. Big risk, big return. What securitization did over the last 15 or 20 years is it created a mechanism that pumped literally hundreds of billions of dollars from all of these institutions looking for investment return. It pumped this money into the U.S. residential real estate market. And you know what the effect was? Let me show you. This is a graph of U.S. residential housing prices in real terms. In other words, I've taken into account inflation. So $1 is $1 of purchasing power regardless of when you're looking at this graph. And the graph goes from 1880 to the peak of the housing market in 2006. Anybody notice anything unusual about this graph? Yeah. This piece right here sticks out like a sore thumb. Within a period of about 10, 15 years, the U.S. residential housing market doubled in value. Over a period of 50 years, the housing market was relatively stable at about 110, according to this index. And in 15 short years, somehow we decided that home prices are worth twice as much as they have been over the previous 50. How did this happen? It happened because unprecedented amounts of capital rushed in to the housing market. Money was made available to homeowners to buy homes that previously they couldn't afford with money that previously they did not have. In fact, when Paul Krugman was asked in early 2000 how he would describe the U.S. economy, he said, well, the U.S. economy is pretty simple. We sell each other homes using money borrowed from the Chinese. You know, there's some truth to that. That was the business that we were in. Now, there was a critical assumption here that we had to make in order to get this pricing equation. And the critical assumption was that these two pieces of paper, the two green pieces of paper, were uncorrelated. They were statistically independent. And that's how we calculated the probability tables, right? What would happen if that assumption were false? What would happen if, in fact, the correlations were not zero? What would happen if a default of one piece of paper somehow was related to the default of another piece of paper? And you might ask, well, why would that happen? First of all, let me explain to you what these green pieces of paper were. These green pieces of paper were mortgages. And financial engineers repackaged those pieces of paper, large pools of them, chopped them up into these tranches, and sold them off to various different parties, hoping, expecting that the power of diversification would allow them to get the returns that were calculated using this simple mathematics. The mathematics that they used were far more complicated, but this gives you all of the relevant intuition. Now, in order for us to get back to the steady state, we need to have housing prices drop from its peak by about 35%. And sure enough, at June of 2006, if you look at what happened to housing prices since then, May of 2009 was the bottom of the U.S. housing market, and it dropped by 33.2%. That's a correction that occurred just recently. On the way down, do you think that these pieces of paper that were statistically uncorrelated on the way up, do you think that maybe they might become correlated on the way down? On the way down, defaults in Reno, Nevada were correlated with defaults in Fresno, California, and Stockton, and Miami, and Phoenix. All of these residential mortgages started defaulting together. And what happens if that occurs? Well, imagine if these two green pieces of paper not only were not independent, suppose they were perfectly correlated. If they were perfectly correlated, they default and they pay off at the same time, then you don't have three states of the world, you only have two. Either 2,000 or zero for the portfolio. Then the two bonds are worth the same. The priority doesn't matter anymore. Either they both pay off or they don't. Then the pricing of these two bonds is now the same, 900, back to the old case. But look what happened. The folks that paid 990 for these bonds, the insurance companies, the pension funds, the money market funds, the banks, the conservative investors that paid 990, they just lost 10% of their investment. And if you're a bank and you have deposited money and you just lost 10%, that's a crisis. On the other hand, the hedge funds that paid 810, they're the ones that benefited. They made money from this. So this crisis basically acted in ways that were exactly counterintuitive to what we were expecting because we didn't understand the math. We didn't understand that these correlations changed overnight and that what we thought were statistically independent, in fact, were quite highly correlated in very different circumstances. Now, in a nutshell, that's the underlying technology. And as I told you, I was going through this for a reason. Now, why am I going through this? Well, I'm going through this to illustrate the fact that crises happen in a number of different industries that are technologically sophisticated because technology is hard. It's hard to understand the underlying components that make these technologies work. For example, the Space Shuttle Challenger, Space Shuttle Columbia, Chernobyl, the Minneapolis Bridge collapse, train wreck in Scotland, 3 Mile Island. These are all disasters that have occurred because of some technology gone awry, some unintended consequence. And I want to spend a little bit of time talking a bit about that. Ultimately, I want to trace it back to human behavior and the fact that humans, when they're involved, are going to engage in certain kinds of cognitive biases and limitations that will cause us to make mistakes. Now, I'm going to do this with an example that I use a lot, which is an example that I've drawn from the cognitive sciences literature. It's an experiment that involves showing an audience a video clip and charging you with a very simple cognitive task. This is a scene from the video clip where students will be passing basketballs back and forth to each other. And the cognitive task I'm going to ask you to engage in is to count the number of times that a basketball is passed from one white t-shirted student to another white t-shirted student. For the purpose of this exercise, only the white t-shirted passes will count. And so the question is, how good are you at counting? Now you might say, how hard could that be? In general, not that hard, except that while you're counting, I'm going to be counting random numbers out loud with you. And you know how annoying that is when you're trying to concentrate and somebody's distracting you? So you're really going to have to focus. Now, how many of you have already seen this clip? If you have, don't give it away to the rest of the audience, okay? Because I think it's kind of striking if you haven't seen this before. So let's give it a try. And here we go. Maximize this. Okay, so that's 1, and that's 2, 3, 5, 6, 7, 9, 11, 10, 13, 15, 16, 18, or 17, or 19, or 15, 16, and maybe that was 18, and that's it. Okay. How many people counted 15, 16, 17, 18, 19? All right, 17 was the right answer. Most of you got it, but not all of you did. Before you start celebrating, let me ask, those of you who haven't seen this clip before, did you see anything else? Gorilla. How many people saw a gorilla? How many people did not see a gorilla? Now wait a minute. We were watching the same clip, right? So let me ask the gentleman here in the front. You're sure you didn't see a gorilla? Would you be willing to testify under oath that you did not see a gorilla? Okay. Let me show this clip again. And now this time, don't count, just watch. And I think you'll see something kind of unusual. Now obviously we're all watching the same clip, and those of you who saw something, you can testify that I'm showing the exact same clip as before. This is not a trick of any sort. How could you have been so wrong? How could you have missed a gorilla? Not only was there a gorilla, but it stood in the middle of the frame and beat its chest. And at least half of you missed it. Now of course, you argue that of course you missed it, because I was asking you to count the passes between the white t-shirted students, and my counting really distracted you, so you had to focus, and you basically filtered out everything that wasn't white t-shirted students. You did a good job. At a cost. You missed the black gorilla. Forget about the black swan if we can't even see a black gorilla in our midst, okay? What that suggests is that all of us have limited cognitive faculties, and therefore human behavior ultimately is going to create limitations on what we can accomplish and the kind of challenges that we can take on. Now, I want to get even more expansive and argue that if you take a look at this chart right here, you'll see the opposite side of human behavior. Anybody know what this graph is? Does this look familiar to anybody? What is it? No, this is not the wealth of the United States, although that would be a good guess. It's the human population, that's right. It's the population of Homo sapiens on this planet from 10,000 BC to 2 years ago. And I don't know how many biologists there are in the audience, but those there are, you can attest to the fact that there aren't too many species with growth curves that look like this. I grew up in New York City, and on occasion, the population of cockroaches in New York looked like this, and then you call an exterminator, and then that's it, you know, puts a limit on it. Humans have been growing unchecked for thousands of years, and it's because we're actually pretty good at it. We're pretty good at taming our environment and reproducing like rabbits because of technology. Technology is critical to society. But technology is a two-edged sword. Technology has positive consequences like that, but it has some unintended consequences, like global warming, like financial crises, like pesticides, like all the other implications of technology that has gotten ahead of our ability to use them responsibly. So now, let me get to the point of the talk, which is that the financial engineering plays an incredibly important role in supporting innovation. Any kind of technological innovation on the scale that affects society today requires five things, these five. Private investment. Public investment is not enough. Government is just not big enough. Like the phrase in Jaws goes, you're going to need a bigger boat. You do not have a big enough boat to deal with the challenges of modern society. You need well-functioning capital markets. You need the proper design of securities, accounting, legal, regulatory structures, and systemic stability. All of those aspects are necessary, but one of the most important ingredients that we don't have enough of is financial engineering. And so what I want to illustrate to you is the possibility. I don't have time to talk about all three challenges, although I have them in my slides. You're welcome to copies of it. I'm not trying to weasel out of them. Let me talk about cancer. I want to argue very boldly that with the proper financial engineering, I think it's possible to cure cancer in 20 years. Now, how do I know that? I don't know that. But I'm going to show you in a minute why I think that. And it's because of financial engineering. I'm not a biologist. I don't know much about cancer research. But I know enough to know that with the proper financial engineering, we could make a really good run at cancer that we are not doing today. Let me show you how. So, what if we could focus the power of financial engineering on raising money for cancer? Now, when I talk about the power of financial engineering, I'm talking about this. We were able to raise hundreds of billions of dollars funneled into houses. What if we could take a little tiny fraction of that and funnel it into cancer research? Do you think that might make a difference? Well, let me show you what I have in mind. Suppose that you're trying to discover a drug to cure cancer. Here's what we know about drug discovery. Drugs are very expensive to develop. Typically, they take about 10 years. The out-of-pocket costs of developing a drug, never mind opportunity costs, the out-of-pocket costs for the typical blockbuster drug is about $500 million. And the chances of success, once you pay that $500 million, the chances of success is about 5%. Some would argue more, some would argue less. 5% is a reasonable estimate, okay? There are many possible mechanisms for curing cancer. And big pharma can't pursue all of them just because of the nature of the risks that are involved and that they have shareholders to deal with. What if we could raise $20 billion for cancer? I want to create a cancer fund that takes $20 billion and funnels it into cancer drug development. What are the chances of success? Well, let's do the math. I've got $20 billion. It takes $500 million to do one trial for a drug from beginning to end. So I got 40 shots, right? The probability of success is 5%. If I assume that these different kinds of cancer mechanisms are independent, that's a big assumption, we'll come back to that. If it's independent, what's the probability of one success in 40 trials where the probability for each trial is 5%? How do you calculate the probability of one success in 40? It's binomial, right? But it's even simpler. It's 1 minus the probability of 40 failures. What's the probability of a failure? 0.95. So 1 minus 0.95 to the 40th power is my probability of success. Anybody know what that number is? It's 87%. 87% success rate over a 10-year period for a cancer fund. Now, how much would you want to invest? Well, I don't know. How much can you charge for cancer drugs? You can't charge anything, as you might think, because there are limits. So if you use the current data on what revenues are for blockbuster drugs, cancer drugs, other drugs, when you do the math, what you get is an expected rate of return of this cancer fund of about 10%. 10% per year return. 10% return for a fund that is completely uncorrelated with traditional investments like the S&P 500. Whether or not the stock market goes up or down, I don't think has any impact on whether cancer is likely to be solved or not. And so here we have an investment vehicle, which if we could pool enough money to raise $20 billion, we might be able to create a vehicle that offers an attractive rate of return to investors. So far, I've talked nothing about humanitarian reasons. I haven't appealed to your greater good. It's not a charity here. I'm talking about making money and solving cancer. Ultimately, that's how we're going to solve society's greatest challenges. It's not to declare war on cancer. It's to put a bounty on its head. It's to make it worthwhile for people to solve cancer, to cure cancer. We can do this. We have the financial technology, and I argue it is about the financial technology, because if you can make it worthwhile, for investors to pool their money, enormous things are possible. Now, is this really possible? Is this really realistic? I don't know. But isn't it worth exploring? The numbers that I put are not outrageous, but they're important in terms of doing the math to figure out whether this investment vehicle is realistic. So what do we need in order to do this? We need cancer researchers to sit down with financial economists and mathematicians and computer scientists and figure out whether or not all of these assumptions, these scientific results that bear on the probability of solving these kinds of problems can actually be packaged in a way that ultimately investors find attractive. If we can do that, if we can make this something that's worthwhile for everybody in the economy to do, we can solve enormous challenges. Now, cold fusion is something that a lot of people think is, voodoo science. But I have news for you. In the last 10 years, there have actually been enormous advances in cold fusion that show that the original Pons and Fleischmann experiments that were thought to be a crock, they actually worked. It was real. And not only was it real, these guys have actually explained why it is that the later experiments could not replicate the first. It turns out it had to do with the purity of the elements that were being used for these experiments. Now again, do I know for a fact that cold fusion is a possibility? I don't. But wouldn't it be worth putting $20 billion in that? And now for global warming, well, there's a lot of people that are skeptical about global warming. There are a lot of people that are skeptical about the solutions for global warming. I think there's a simple solution. The simple solution is to put an umbrella out there in space and block the sun. Now, it's expensive to put an umbrella out there, and moreover, it's very hard to stabilize it, and there are meteorites that come and tear it apart. So instead of an umbrella, what about 1 trillion umbrellas that are 3 meters wide? And what if they're autonomously powered by small robots that are programmed to act like a swarm and provide shields for the sun? Might this work? I don't know. But is it worth $20 billion to try it out? Can we get $20 billion to apply to this? The financial crisis, if it's taught us anything, it's taught us that tremendous things are possible. But we have to structure the right vehicles to get the resources that we need. And frankly, one of the most valuable resources is sitting in the room right now. It's all of you. Education is where it begins. Getting excited about these problems, using mathematics in ways to change our lives, I think, is ultimately how we're going to get out of these problems. And with the proper financial structures, we can do that. So let me conclude by pointing out that over the next several years, we're actually going to be reimagining our societal infrastructure, certainly in the financial community, but I think much larger than that. And therefore, we need to spend every effort we can to take the best ideas, create the best structures, and channel the proper resources. If we can do that, then truly, I think there's nothing that we can't accomplish. But if we don't do that, we're in trouble. So hopefully, all of you will now go out and take these ideas and put them into practice. And in 5 or 10 years, I want to see this cancer fund. I want to see these umbrellas out there. And I want to see cars running on water, because I think it is possible, and all of you are going to make it happen. Thank you.
We have time for 1 or 2 questions from the audience. Anybody?
The financial market with a big spike. There's also a 30 to 50% correction over the last 3 years. You haven't mentioned anything of a correction factor in your models. Did I miss something, or am I being overly negative?
No, you're not. You didn't miss anything, nor are you being negative. The fact of the matter is that corrections are part of the process. In other words, it's definitely 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And sometimes it's 2 steps forward and 3 steps back. So what we have to accept, along with the very many benefits of financial innovation, is unintended consequences. There's no doubt about that. A good example, a realistic example, is forest fires. Nowadays, we have very few forest fires, much fewer than in the years past. And it's because the U.S. Forest Service has a policy of putting out every fire, no matter how small, no matter where it is. What's the unintended consequence of that? Well, the unintended consequence is now, when there's a forest fire, it's really huge. It's millions of acres instead of tens of thousands of acres. And it's because by putting out all the small fires, you allow the brush to grow. And the brush is tinder for the bigger fires when they occur. So that's an example of a technology that's good. Putting out fires is a good thing. It preserves a lot of homes and valuable property. But what it means is now, on occasion, we have to live with humongous forest fires. I think the same is true of the financial system. We're good at putting out smaller fires, and we miss the really big one that we're now dealing with. And it may well be that over time, we're going to continue with that cycle. I think that it's impossible to rule out crises, because crises happens to be a human consequence. When you allow freedom of capital market development with human behavior, when you couple those two together, you're going to get crises. But saying that crises are inevitable doesn't mean that we can't do anything about it. Hurricanes are inevitable, but you can do a lot to prepare for them and reduce the amount of damage. Crises are inevitable, but we can do a lot to prepare for those corrections. So the question, for those of you who couldn't hear, is that there's a sense out there that some of the lax regulatory policies of the Clinton administration contributed to the current financial crisis. Let me make a broad statement, which is that there are a number of factors, including regulatory forbearance, that contributed. In other words, when things are good, when markets are going well, it's very hard for regulators to say, time to stop and put away the punch bowl. You've had enough. It's very hard. Yes. Yeah. Well, there are a number of different policies, including Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were actually encouraged to make loans to subprime borrowers. Now we say, how horrible, how irresponsible. Back then we said, how wonderful that you're allowing people that otherwise couldn't afford homes to buy homes. It was a social policy that we all agreed upon until it didn't work. So, There was a large proportion of the loans out there were actually underwritten by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And so that was a big part of it. Private accounted for some part, but at some point Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac started competing with the private sector. In fact, that was one of the reasons why they grew to the point that they did, is because they were actually, in many cases, circumvented because of Wall Street. Wall Street started getting interested in this market in the early 2000s, and that caused competition for Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. So it's complex, and what it suggests is that all of us, we're all human. That's not to say that there wasn't any wrongdoing. I'm sure there was, and hopefully we'll ferret that out and punish the parties that were at fault. But even if everybody was acting perfectly ethically and in their own client's best interest, even in that case, these kinds of systemic shocks can occur, and they will occur again. So we need to recognize that aspect of human behavior and deal with it directly.
On one of your slides, you had a picture of the Challenger tragedy, and, well, it is a known example when the dilemma between managers and engineers went out of hand.
Yes.
So essentially, you're talking about creating financial structures that would pour money into research, but at the same time, we're creating this situation where eager for get some quick gains and desire to do robust research will come into conflict.
Mm-hmm.
So by perpetuating the financial mechanism to the global level, like cover the entire Earth from sun, aren't we we're perpetuating the scale of the mistake if the manager win? They shouldn't.
Yes.
Are we endangering ourselves on a much larger scale? Thank you.
The answer, very simply, is yes, we are. Absolutely. Make no mistake about it. The stakes are higher. The stakes are much, much higher. That's one of the reasons why I think it's so important for all of you to be here tonight and to start getting involved. It's because the stakes are tremendously higher. But we didn't raise the stakes. Or rather, the stakes were raised on us. Global warming is going to happen, whether we have the financial structure to deal with it or not. Cancer is happening, whether or not we fight it with a $20 billion fund or not. And we're running out of fossil fuels, whether we like it or not. So the stakes are absolutely higher, and you know why they're higher? It's that growth curve I showed you. In 1900, the population of this planet was 1.5 billion people. Last year, 100 years later, the population of this planet, 7.5 billion people. That's a lot of people. A lot more than 1.5 billion. So the stakes are absolutely higher. And so the risk is higher, but frankly, what we're talking about, in my view, is survival. It doesn't get any higher than that. We're playing Russian roulette now, and hopefully we can have the odds tilted in our favor with these technologies.
So I agree that the stakes are higher, but aren't there alternatives to addressing these stakes? I mean, what would you bet on? Madison Avenue deciding how to fund research, or government deciding how to fund? I mean, isn't government funding of research an alternative, a viable alternative to what you're proposing?
You know, it could be, but the problem is that the scale is simply not big enough. You know, for example, the TARP program, $700 billion, that's not enough in order to be able to deal with the financial crisis. We're still dealing with unemployment that's north of 9%. We don't have enough funds. So $20 billion is not a big deal from the government perspective. But I think that if you expect government to start making those kinds of investments, it's going to require a certain degree of political will that ultimately is just not there. It may be there over time, but by the time it gets there, it may be too late. By the time that the government agrees that there's a real problem with climate change, you know, we may be, you know, crispy by that point. And I think that's really the problem. I think that the private sector ultimately is going to have to be involved in some manner. And if we can construct these mechanisms and vehicles to benefit everybody, I mean, I think everyone in this room would be willing to pay, I don't know, would people be willing to contribute $2,000 of their 401k money to a cancer fund? A one-time investment, $2,000. How many people would be willing to do that? There are certainly more than 10% of this audience raise their hands. Well, there are 130 million households in the United States. 10% of those, if they each contributed $2,000, that's your $20 billion right there. And that's nothing. I wouldn't mind losing $2,000 trying to cure cancer over a 10-year period. I'd love to be able to do that. And if I can get a 10% rate of return, wonderful. That's the power of financial markets. And maybe it's not 20 billion, maybe it's 200 billion. Maybe we need $2 trillion. If the financial crisis has shown us anything, it has shown us that these numbers are not nearly as scary as before. We can actually do that. We can afford to do that. In fact, I would argue we can't afford not to do that at this point.
Okay, well, I think we should end here and thank the speaker again.
Thank you.
Anyone needing a certificate of attendance, please come down.